Okay, this is our first one. What I'm going to do is go through John chapter 2. This was part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Sunday school lesson for, was it last week, I believe. Anyway, I wanted to share some things out of this section that I didn't see were, naturally they wouldn't be highlighted in the lesson, but I thought they were really amazing. And so I wanted to share them with anyone who found this video. Welcome. I call this channel Between the Lines. I've been working on kind of what I've been working on for this year in my personal study is finding, using the New Testament, and the Gospels, and the teachings of Jesus Christ to help me understand the Old Testament and find things in the Old Testament and in the Law of Moses. So I wanted to share one of those with you today. All right, so in John 2, let me open up my scriptures here, and I'm going to do all this live. I have nothing ready on my computer because I want you to see how I go through, how I study the scriptures, how I use keywords, how to read between the lines, and to find some really neat gems using that stuff. So, going into my library, opening up my scriptures to the New Testament. I'm going to open up John chapter 2. All right, so you probably read this. Jesus turns water into wine in Cana. He attends the Passover, cleanses the temple, foretells his death and resurrection, and performs miracles. So in John chapter 2, in the Come Follow Me, I'll open up a new tab for that. It seems like they used chapter 2 primarily to focus on the miracle of turning water into wine, which is great. While I was reading it, the first thing that I thought was really cool is that this whole chapter is kind of focused on the Passover. And Christ is obviously the Passover lamb. I believe he was born at Passover. And so there's a whole bunch of symbolism and imagery about the Passover. And I think the word, when they use the word the Passover here in John 2, John is trying to help us link what they're talking about with the Law of Moses and the chapter about the Passover, Exodus 12 and 13. So that's kind of what I started to do, but there was something else. So when I got down to verse 18, so this is after the miracle of the wine, after he cleanses the temple, which is huge symbolism of the cleansing out the leaven of the house in Passover, which you guys probably already know. But 18, I want to walk you through something I learned using a method that an LDS member who grew up Jewish, his name's Rob K. Using the method he kind of talks about a little bit. I used it here because he's not told me this, but by using his method of analyzing the scripture, it was something that I learned, and it was really cool. Okay, John chapter 2, verse 18. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, Jesus, what sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said unto them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Okay, so a few things that grabbed my attention. The phrase of 3 days, which I'll go into more detail here in a minute. The first reason is that it includes a number, and in the manner of studying among the Jews, numbers mean things, names mean things, and so anytime numbers and names are present, those should jump out at you, and you should pay attention to them. The other thing about it is that John uses that phrase twice. He uses it in verse 19 and then in verse 20. And then he tells us that 3 days, well, just because of the structure of the scriptures, right? You have in 19, he says 3 days. 20, he says 3 days. And in 21, John says, but he spake of the temple of his body. So right away, he's telling us that this has to do with the resurrection. So in our minds, we could kind of picture 3 days is equal to something about the resurrection. All right. And then in 22, this is the other thing that stood out to me. So a lot of times in the Gospels, all through the Gospels, it seems like especially in Matthew and John, I'm not as familiar with Mark and Luke, but a lot of times after when they're closing a scene or talking about something Christ said, they'll throw in a scripture from the Old Testament showing that Christ is fulfilling prophecy, right? But here it just says, John just says, and they believed the scripture. What scripture? And the word Jesus had said. Well, what was the word that he said? What was the word they're talking about? I think, and this is just my opinion, I think the word they're pointing to is the word 3 days, or the words. And that the scripture is a scripture that's found in the Torah. So the reason I'm going to go to the Torah is this, that, and this is what I learned from Rob Kay, that when you're studying and analyzing the scriptures and you see these keywords, numbers, names, phrases that mean things, they're meant to take you back to the beginning. And the reason they take you back to the beginning is that it's the law of Moses. So you can use the law because it's the source material for the prophets and then for the other writings of the Bible. The Torah acts not just as the kind of the foundation, but it's also like a dictionary and a thesaurus, because it gives context for all the significant terms that are used later on. So that's where I want to go. All right, so I'm going to open up a new window, and I've already done this, but if you go to your Gospel Library app on your phone, what you can do is in the search bar, type in 3 days, and then right below that, click on Collections, Scriptures, and then scroll that menu over. Scroll it from right to left, and you can select exact phrase. And what that will do is take that phrase 3 days, and it will select only the scriptures that have that exact phrase. And then under that, in the filters, you can sort the results chronologically. So you can get the first reference to the last reference according to the order in the scriptures. So I think the first or second is in Genesis chapter 40. So I'm going to open up a new window because I'm not on my phone. I'm recording with my phone. Genesis chapter 40. And we just studied the Old Testament, so this should be fairly fresh, but I doubt many of you, I don't remember talking about this in Sunday school or hearing about it from Come Follow Me fellows. Okay, the chapter summary says, Joseph interprets the dreams of Pharaoh's chief butler and chief baker. So not the Pharaoh, his butler and his baker, because they get thrown into prison, right? The butler fails to tell Pharaoh about Joseph. Okay. All right. I'm just going to skip first. So remember, we were looking for the phrase 3 days. So it shows up here in verse 12. It says, and Joseph said unto him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore thee unto thy place. Does that sound like resurrection to you? It sounds like resurrection to me. To lift up his head and to restore him. I think the Book of Mormon uses the word restore when it's talking about resurrection. And lift up, so I took this into the Hebrew Bible that I use here. I might go into that. Sepharia. The word lift up, you could also do this in a concordance. The word lift up comes from the Hebrew word nasa and is akin to the Greek word, I don't know how to pronounce Greek, hupsu, translated as lift up in John 12:32. So that could take you back to John. And that one says, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. Okay, awesome resurrection imagery, right? And the verse continues, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner when thou wast his butler. So that was really exciting when I found this. And so to further investigate, I thought, okay, I'm going to start at the beginning of the chapter and go through and just pick out any word that might hint to Christ or be connected to Christ. So I'm going to show you what I found. We're going to start in verse 9 when the butler begins to tell Joseph of his dream. He says, in my dream, behold, a vine was before me. What is the vine? What is that? Well, in John 15:1, Christ says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. So there's one. And in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. What is that? What are the ripe grapes? Well, I don't know about you, but what came to my mind was the whole idea of first fruits, and Christ being the first fruits. So, I found in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20 and 21, Paul says, but now is Christ risen from the dead, and become the first fruits of them that slept. For since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. All right, so another resurrection symbol. First fruits. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. What is that? So first of all, it's butler, right? The Pharaoh's butler, and the Pharaoh's cup is in his hand. All right, what could that be? What is the cup? The cup. So I wrote down for this, the vessel of salvation. Why? Well, in John 18, verse 11, it says, then said Jesus unto Peter, put up thy sword. So this is right after Peter cuts off the guy's ear when the priests and the officers come to take him after he prays in the garden, right? And he says to Peter, put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? All right, so now we're getting into some atonement imagery, right? The Pharaoh's cup has to do with the atonement. And who is Pharaoh? Well, from that scripture in John 18:11, it's the Father's cup, and here it's the Pharaoh's cup. So Pharaoh is the Father. And I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup. So back in Genesis now. And the butler's pressing the grapes into the cup. And he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Okay? So the grapes, remember, representing Christ as the first fruits. The butler presses the grapes, representing the atonement. And one scripture link for that would be Isaiah 63, verse 3. I have trodden the winepress alone, and of the people there was none with me. There you go. So, pressing the wine, trodden the winepress, press the grapes. Awesome imagery. All right, and then Joseph gives his interpretation of it. And we already read this. I'll read it again. The 3 branches are the 3 days. Within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore thee unto thy place. And thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner, when thou wast his butler. All right. I'm sure you're having some awesome ideas about the atonement, about Christ, about the resurrection, and how they tie into this chapter about the butler. All right, the next verse, Genesis 40:14, I call the intercession verse in my notes, because this is where Joseph is pleading with the butler that when the butler gets to Pharaoh, when he's restored to his former manner, as it says, that he remembers Joseph and makes intercession for him with Pharaoh and brings him out of the prison. And as we know at the end of the chapter in verse 23, it says, the butler remembered, did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. So, where the butler fails in making intercession with the Pharaoh for Joseph, Christ succeeds. Christ intercedes for us with the Father. I tied that scripture to, let's see, which one was that? Think on me. I think it was DNC 45. Let me go there real quick. So, TLDS. I thought I put that in my scripture links, but maybe I didn't. But it's a good one, and it ties right into this idea of Christ interceding for us. Scriptures, Doctrine and Covenants, section, I think it's 45. And, okay, verse 3, 4, 5. Listen to him who is the advocate with the Father, who is pleading your cause before him, saying, Father, behold the sufferings and death of him who did no sin, in whom thou wast well pleased. Behold the blood of thy Son which was shed, the blood of him whom thou gavest, that thyself might be glorified. Wherefore, Father, spare these, my brethren, that believe on my name, that they may come unto me and have everlasting life. All right. So, that's Pharaoh's dream, and there's additional imagery. So in verse 20 of Genesis 40, talks about the third day. You could link that right back to John 2, because at the beginning of John 2, there's the third day in verse 1, and that's what begins the wedding feast. And here you have a birthday feast. And you could say Passover was Christ's birthday feast. Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. All his servants were invited to the birthday feast. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants, and restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Now, I'm pretty sure the baker goes right along in here with this idea of resurrection. I think in the Book of Mormon, when it talks about, I think it's Alma who talks about being restored to good and being restored to bad, depending on how you lived, obviously. But anyway, I hope you liked that. I'd love to hear what you guys learned, if this was helpful, but also if you guys have additional insights. I learn from other people, but I take it upon myself to study things out, and so I would love to hear what you guys learned, and if there were other keywords from John 2 that were noteworthy to you. See you later.